Thanks, Julie, and good morning, everyone. Obviously, following Robert is no mean task, and there's quite a bit of complementary material between the two of us. So while I have quite a lot of slides, several of them Robert has dealt with, so I can very quickly move on from them. I suppose what I want to get across this morning is how this time around things are quite materially different than our very first attempt back in 2002, and that central government have learned hard lessons from past mistakes, but that it's a very difficult task what is being proposed, and will need sustained effort and focus and resources over a long period of time, because market forces have been so embedded. Like the trends that we've seen in spatial development in Ireland over the last 3-4 decades are not by accident. And to change those patterns of development will require a very concerted effort at every level of government to make it happen. But having said that, the structures are starting to be put in place, the building blocks are there, and the challenge now is, can we make it happen? And I'm actually, having worked 34 years in the coalface, I can see that circumstances are changing. What we're looking at now, I'm going to talk about what the new structures are. To give you, obviously a lot of you will know a lot about this, but I want to give you just a few insights of what's really different and how that's going to make a change. The first thing is that the way the NPF and the NDP were launched, the fact that for the first time ever in the history of the state, we've got an integration between our capital programmes and our planning framework. It's amazing that the state has taken this long to put that together. Those of you who are familiar with the NSS, launched in 2002, the capital plan was already launched in 2000. Was there whole of government buy-in to the NSS? Clearly not. Individual ministers went off and made decisions very quickly after the NSS was launched, contrary to the plans. So the NPF and the NDP put together the Ireland 2040. Implementation has been thought about right from the start, and that's fundamentally different. And fundamentally, having this integration between the means to make it happen and the framework. But what is also critically important is that the framework itself, the National Planning Framework, is very consciously introducing disruptive policies into the policy framework in Ireland. It has looked at the business as usual. What happens if we just continue the way we have been going for the last 20, 30 years? Is it sustainable? And of course it's not. But what are the policy interventions that can make a change? And that's what the NPF has sought to do very, very explicitly. It's often mentioned that, the NSS had no legal status. It actually did have legal status. It had status in the 2000 Planning and Development Acts. But what's very important is that the NPF and future iterations of it, and that's very important too, because there's a built-in requirement now to review the National Planning Framework every 6 years. It will now be subjected to full assent of Parliament. To be having to lay before the House of the Oireachtas to get their approval future iterations of the NPF is very important. It gives it very strong democratic legitimacy. Robert touched on this right from the off. at the most senior level in government. So Secretary Generals are sitting around the table monitoring on a regular basis how the MPF is being implemented. And to do that, you have to be very explicit and clear what the objectives are. And that is now done because you can see very easily in the MPF what are the national objectives. What are the objectives of the framework? How is it going to be measured? What is it attempting to change? What are the change parameters? And they're going to be tracked and monitored. If you think about it, the NSS introduced this lovely concept of regional potential. Who knows? Did the NSS, what did it achieve? What you don't measure, how do you know if you're going in the right direction? Alignment this time around is it really is at the centre of what's different. And that's why I am very optimistic about full implementation this time around. This alignment both in policy terms and in alignment with the national funding, which we've never had before. And that clearly, Robert has mentioned this in his own presentation. Not alone are the big capital sectoral programmes now fully aligned with the national objectives in the MPF, but for the first time ever, there are dedicated funds for specific purposes which are directly identified and designed to deliver aspects of the national planning framework. The second bit of the alignment that's really, really critical, and Robert did touch on it a little bit, is that you must have alignment throughout the planning hierarchy. Simply adopting a national plan at central government level, if that's all you did, it won't be achieved because it has to be implemented on the ground. There has to be full buy-in across the public sector, from central government to regional government to local government. All of those have to be aligned. And we've not managed to do that to date. And this is now the purpose of having the national planning framework first, to be quickly followed by these new regional strategies, which I'll speak more about, and in turn having local development plans fully aligned with regional plans, with national plans. And all of that is now being put into legislation with the 2018 Planning and Development Act just enacted earlier this summer, because for the first time it is making sure that there is full consistency across the planning hierarchy. I mentioned about this disruptive policies, and what's obviously what's very different than its predecessor this time around is that government did take very hard decisions. They came under huge pressure between the draft and the final version of the MPF to have a very definite growth focus on a limited number of sustainable urban centres. That's a very difficult thing given our political makeup in terms of particularly the way the current makeup in the Dáil. So you can now see a very definitive growth path that has been set. Very specific targets have been set, and so we will be able to see, is that followed through? Does investment follow those policy decisions that the whole of government have taken, that the capital plan is behind now, the dedicated funds are being put in place, that a national active land management agency is being established, all to make sure that this is followed through. Because it won't happen by chance. The only way that the regional cities will grow at the sort of rate that is projected in the MPF is if jobs are created in the regions. About 50% of future population growth will be accounted for by migration, both internal and external migration. Past trends of migration, and based on international experience, the external migration largely comes to capital cities first and trickles out. And internal migration, highly volatile based on economic conditions. So if you get the conditions right, there will be migration internally from largely the Greater Dublin area to the regions. Not long after the MPF was published, the responsible Minister for Housing Planning and Local Government published a roadmap. And it's very important. It's an implementation roadmap. So it's setting out how the MPF is to be implemented. And those are the 5 areas that the roadmap covered. And the first 2 we've dealt with already. So for the rest of the presentation, I want to concentrate now on some of the new innovations that were introduced in the MPF to assist implementation. As you know, the MPF, as it says on the tin, it's a framework. It's not a detailed plan, it's a framework. And much of the detail has now to fall to the regional strategies to fill in the detail. So it set the broad parameters, it set the high-level targets. Now that has to be worked out in detail in the regional strategies. And again, the name gives you a very clear picture of what's different this time around. We've moved away from the NSS and the regional planning guidelines. We now have integrated economic and spatial planning at a regional level, backed up with central government funding. And it's clear from what the MPF says and what the legislation says of the critical importance that now attaches to these new regional strategies. And these strategies, their sole purpose is strategies to implement the MPF and government economic policies. So again, their role is implementation. One of the big issues that has emerged over the summer since the MPF was launched, people were getting sort of fixated on population figures, and already the battle lines are drawn. The 5 cities are going to get everything, and there's nothing left, and rural Ireland is going to be decimated, and so on. The objective of the regional strategies is how do you develop all parts of the regions based on their inherent strengths, capabilities, capacities. How do you generate sufficient sustainable employment across the regions? How can the cities lead as engines of regional growth? How can public policies create the environment that will be receptive to a changing world and an ever technologically advanced society, a knowledge economy, and so on? So the people behind working on these regional strategies, the term that is being used is this idea of co-production, because the regional assemblies can't do it all themselves. So it's about bringing all of the key stakeholders together to work on common agendas that each organisation contribute their bit bit towards the objectives. Coming down the next scale down again, if you think about it, the ambition for the Cork and Limerick and Galway and Waterford, to double their population over a 20-year period, which has never been achieved before. As you know, our public administration system is based on local authority boundaries that were drawn in the Victorian health districts and assize courts and so on. They don't reflect reality on the ground. So all of our cities straddle 2 or 3 or 4 local authority areas. So the idea of the metropolitan plans is to plan at a functional level what makes sense. Cities work across boundaries. How do you integrate land use and transportation planning? How do you ensure that the objectives of the MPF and the funding that potentially is there, how do you ensure that what's needed in the cities is delivered? And what's really, really important is that the level of catch-up that's needed in the provincial cities is of such a scale that a lot of catalytic investment from the state is needed very early on to convince the marketplace that these policies are for real and are serious and can deliver the level of housing demand, the level of ambition for job creation in the regions. So the metropolitan plans have to identify and quantify the key strategic sites that are available consistent with national policy of compact urban growth. So how do we develop brownfield sites at higher densities along public transport corridors and so on, given that it has always been so much easier to build on greenfield sites on the edge of the cities. And that's why the state has felt it needed to intervene much more actively now in land management, because as Robert said, the real issue at the moment in terms of the scarcity of supply of housing is primarily down to land and the availability in the right place at the right time at the right price. And we do have a dysfunctional marketplace at the moment that requires intervention. So one of the really, really important things, and this is someone who has spent probably 30 years looking for this, and it's finally happened, is to have very significant funding to implement the policies that are contained in the National Planning Framework. And for the first time ever, to have 3,000 million euros of investment available for the people who know best to know for their locality what's needed to unlock the development potential of their cities or towns or villages or communities. So for local authorities in particular, in the cities and towns, to be able to bid for large-scale, competitive, integrated projects across the whole sector, cross-sectoral approach. What is needed in Cork or Galway or Limerick or Waterford? What are the things that can really unlock the development potential of those cities that will act as drivers for the regional economies? And this is really, really important. And then in terms of the land management, as I say, brownfield redevelopment is inherently extremely difficult. If it wasn't, it would be happening. So the Naas Road has been spoken about for years. Like I know 15 years ago we were talking about, it doesn't make sense, that low-level usage along the transport corridor. 15 years later, how many sites have been redeveloped? at high density along that Lewis corridor? You can count them on one hand. So it really is difficult, and it needs the expertise, the skills and the resources to help make it happen. And that's why we strongly support this creation of this agency. So in summary, I think we're in a very good place. I think the foundations, the right policy mix is there. The funding has now been fully integrated with it. The alignment between national, local, regional and local is being put in place. Development plan reviews are going to be put on a cycle now, coterminous with intercensal periods. So all of those things have been put in place. The question now is there sufficient, I suppose, courage and determination at political and administrative level to make these hard decisions, to stay the course and to implement fully the National Planning Framework. Thank you very much.